Canadian Parliament did the unthinkable at an event honoring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, where they're going to shovel a whole bunch more money in his direction. He was on his world tour asking for more money in the United States and then Canada and other spots. So this is what the Canadian Parliament did. They brought in a 98-year-old former Waffen SS soldier. Yes, you don't get more Nazi than that, actually. The Waffen SS, of course, were the worst of the worst, carrying out the most vile of killings at concentration camps. But this particular Waffen SS unit that this guy served in was responsible for burning alive thousands of Poles. So I wonder how the Polish feel about this little celebration over the weekend. During the Nuremberg trials, of course, the Waffen SS were labeled war criminals, a criminal organization. So what did Canada do? They gave him a standing ovation. Watch.
Zelenskyy's speech received at least a dozen standing ovations. There was also one for this man, a 98-year-old Ukrainian Canadian who fought for Ukrainian independence against the Russians during the Second World War.
Journalist David Krayden, who writes at the Post Millennial, has the Krayden's Right on YouTube, is in Canada and joins us now. David, I don't even know what to say about this. You watched this unfold. What in the world was the Canadian Parliament thinking? No one vets this guy? Let's put a Nazi up in front and give him a standing ovation? And it wasn't like unintentional. It was literally reading out his resume and asking people to basically get up and give this big round of applause.
Well, Clayton, this is a very sad day for Canada and for veterans, real veterans of Canada. As everybody knows, and I know you are very well versed in the Second World War, Canada was one of three nations on D-Day that stormed the beaches of Normandy to fight Nazism. Canada punched above its weight during the Second World War, and our veterans can attest to that. This was so unbelievable to bring a former Waffen SS soldier into Parliament to stand and receive a standing ovation from every member of Parliament. Every member of Parliament stood up and applauded this man. It was so unbelievable. When I first heard the story being talked about on social media early Sunday morning, I said, it can't be true. I said, I can't run with this story because I don't want to slander anybody. And even Justin Trudeau, I don't think he's capable of this. But yes, he was. Now, the Speaker of the House, Anthony Rota, who is the Member of Parliament for North Bay, from which this former Waffen SS soldier, Yaroslav Hunka, is from, he is claiming today that it was all his idea. I have trouble believing that because the Speaker in Canada's House of Commons does not have the power that the United States Speaker of the House possesses. It's a very different position. The Speaker in Canada does not control the legislative agenda and would not be inviting someone like this to an event that is all about Justin Trudeau and Volodymyr Zelenskyy without getting Trudeau's approval. So I don't believe the Speaker did this all by himself. And I think this is an outrage. I think the Speaker should resign. Not only because he made this very poor decision, but because he seems to be so ignorant about history that he thinks someone who fought the Russians in the Second World War was fighting on Canada's side.
Right. Well, it's outrageous on so many levels. I want to kind of get into the legal side of it in a second if we can. But, you know, in the United States, in April of 2018 specifically, 50 U.S. lawmakers petitioned the United States State Department to urge the Ukrainian and Polish governments to take action against, quote, a rise in glorification of Holocaust-era officials across Europe, including in Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Baltic states. This is a worrying trend, they wrote, that must elicit a firm response from our government. This is literally Ro Khanna's website, Congressman, in 2018. Here's his website. Where it says, please stop honoring people who were responsible for the Holocaust. I mean, so the U.S. has been fully aware of this for years, hunting down literal Nazis, even in their 90s, and bringing them to justice. How are these people, I know there was like 200 or 2,000 Waffen SS who were brought into Canada, almost like, I don't know, given amnesty or protection or whatever. How are they not being prosecuted, rounded up? I mean, here's a guy getting an applause, a standing ovation. Where is the police coming in and actually, now we've got the guy, let's arrest the guy. You know how many people he's responsible for killing?
Well, I can't speculate on whether or not he's going to be arrested for war crimes. But I can tell you that why hasn't the Canadian government done anything about this? Because they were complicit in bringing in Nazis to Canada. And I compared this in my post-millennial article yesterday to Operation Paperclip in the United States, where the United States government knowingly brought Nazi rocket scientists and other high-level scientists into the United States, gave them amnesty, basically made their past disappear. They became U.S. citizens, and many of them part of the NASA space program. It's very similar. So are there embarrassments here? You might recall a decade or two ago, another Ukrainian Canadian was discovered. He was called Ivan the Terrible. He was a concentration camp guard. This guy had been living in Canada for decades. Suddenly they found him. How many more people are out there? Well, I'm sure many of them are dead now. I mean, Mr. Hunka is 98 years old. There's very few people who live to be that age. But the real legacy here, for me, is that once again, we're seeing that morality means nothing in power politics. And Canada obviously made a grave mistake here. But not only that, this is not the first time the Trudeau government has been wrapped up in Ukraine's pro-Nazi activities. Our finance minister, who's also the deputy PM, Chrystia Freeland, was walking around with a scarf depicting the neo-Nazi colors that the Azov regiment in Ukraine, which is supposedly fighting hard against the Russians right now, has adopted. It's a neo-Nazi regiment. They make no bones about it. And yet Canada has said nothing. And for that matter, Joe Biden has said nothing about this Azov regiment and its links to the Waffen SS and to neo-Nazism.
No, they'll totally whitewash this and push this under the rug. In fact, as journalist Jacques Bode writes in his newest book, that I encourage everyone to pick up on Ukraine specifically, he says that Ukraine has a big Holocaust denial problem. And it's really rooted in the rise of the Azov Battalion following the U.S.-led Maidan coup in 2014. So it's intentional, like the intentional denying of what happened in World War II, this sort of covering up of this. It's strange. It really is absolutely strange. And then you have Trudeau at this weird, really weird speech, getting this like fake impassioned. I felt like he was like an actor. I just want to play this soundbite for our audience and get your take on this. It just felt like he was like doing something for Hollywood. And by the way, notice the fly that's on his forehead the entire time. I don't know how anyone can give a speech like that with a fly stuck on your forehead, but watch this.
Canadians know this is a question of right or wrong. Canadians know that, yes, it is incredibly hard for Ukraine to continue to stand against a Russian aggression. And let's be honest, it's hard for the democracies around the world who are there to support their citizens, who are investing for the future, who are challenged with a challenging economy around the world to continue to step up as Canada has with close to $9 billion in aid for Ukraine. But we will, because the cost on Canadians, on our lives, on our world will be so much greater if Putin wins this war that we will and have to stand every single day until Ukraine wins this war.
So, yeah, we need to double down. Putin must lose. That's the only way for democracy to survive. And we need to send billions more. So how much more is Canada going to send?
Well, Trudeau promised another $260 million and another 8 armored personnel carriers to replace the ones Ukraine has lost to the Russians. They've also lost just about all of our Leopard tanks because Trudeau has given those away. At the same time, he is once again starving our own military of funding and saying he's never going to reach that magical 2% of the GDP that he's promised NATO over the years. But I just wanted to make one point that really hit me hard yesterday, because I'm always reading about high school students in Canada and the United States who think Canada and its allies, including the United States and Great Britain, fought with the Germans. Well, obviously, they can't be faulted too much. If the Speaker of the House of Commons seems to think that we were fighting the Russians during the Second World War, his history is so bad, or he's so imbecilic, there's a huge problem here. This man should not be Speaker of the House if he doesn't even know vital Canadian history. I think it's very important to know that our allies in the Second World War were the Russians. We were not fighting with the Germans. God forbid. We were fighting the same civilization against the Nazis. And some people today in a high level of government like this don't even seem to know that. That's pathetic. Absolutely pathetic.
It's pathetic, but it's intentional, right? It's the intentional obfuscation of this information so that people aren't made aware of it, so we can continue to funnel tens of billions of dollars into Ukraine. I mean, heck, the only mainstream journalist that I can remember that asked the tough question of Zelenskyy on television was Brett Baer at Fox News on a Sunday show, and he asked him specifically about the Azov Battalion. Now, when Fox later then published it on their website, later it was removed. They edited that part out. So this, of course, there's an intentional cover-up of what is actually going on there on the part of the deep state and the military-industrial complex that we can't. That's a bridge too far. We can't admit publicly that we're sending money into to support Nazism, but that's exactly what's happening.
It harkens back to 1984, the novel to me, where Oceania was always at war with the opponent they were fighting at that time. And it's like we're being told that today. We've always been at war with Russia. This is a good thing. We've always been fighting Russia. It's never been any different. And I think you're right. This is intentional to convince people that we've got to up this war with Russia to the point where we're going to be getting into a nuclear confrontation because of these imbeciles who are making military planning and who don't seem to realize that the Russia of today possesses the same number of nuclear warheads as the Russia of 20 years ago, of 30 years ago. And it was a bad idea to start a nuclear war then. It's just as bad an idea as to start a nuclear war today because it's going to mean a cataclysm that will engulf the whole world.
Yeah, from your mouth to God's ears. We hope that cooler heads prevail, but it doesn't seem likely, at least in Washington and Canada, and what's going on in the Canadian Parliament. David, great to see you. Thank you so much for this. And Canada continues to stun us all, unfortunately. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Clayton.
Yeah, so unbelievable.
Yeah.
And, it is amazing that Trudeau comes out, just a short time ago and says, yeah, hey, whatever. That's Russian propaganda. That has nothing to do with, it. And we had nothing to do with it. And it was
it was the Russians who chose him and stood up and applauded.
I guess so.
It was the Russians who did that.
I really want to dissect that. I really want to dissect that because, that means what? Like Russia is deciding who speaks before Canadian Parliament, which I highly doubt. Or did Russia, this guy was a plant and he's been pretending not to be a Nazi all this time in Canada as a Russian plant, and then finally, the last moment, he's like, surprise, they did a Scooby-Doo ending and they let's
pull the mask off.
Who this guy really is. Oh, he's a Nazi.
If it wasn't for those pesky kids, he would have gotten away with it.
Right. Or it's so confusing.
Well, and also it should be clear, the news reporting about it, we played you the clip of the woman reporter who's like, there were many, many standing ovations for Zelenskyy, and even one for this 98-year-old Ukrainian man who fought bravely against the Russians in World War II. It's like, do you not know your history at all?
Right.
Are you that dopic? You really don't understand? And think
that we were on the same side. So it replaced Russians with Americans, fought against Americans. That means you were, by process of elimination.
She could have just said that. She could have said, yes, this man fought bravely against the Americans in World War II. Substitute. Really
would have been
matter.
The same.
Yeah, and in their context, Canada was on our side too. So she could have said, this guy bravely fought against Canada in World War II. Let's honor him.
That would have been similar. And now there are Trudeau liberals coming out and saying, we must not politicize this, which is so rich because liberals love to politicize anything that they can call related to Nazism or extremism, like the trucker convoy. So please, other side, don't do what we love to do.
It was kind of amazing to call this out and to really dive deeply into his history and to confirm not only was he in the Waffen SS, but he was in a really terrible group. He was like the worst of the worst. So this wasn't like he was like a clerk at a library who worked for the Nazis. Like he worked in the Nazi library and just like checked out books and like, oh, he was just the librarian. No. This is as bad as it gets.
Well, there was a case in America where there was somebody who was like a bookkeeper in a Nazi regime who was brought to prosecution in Germany not too long ago. In America, we still have decided to either extradite or prosecute people who were Nazis. So there is no discussion there of like, how's this guy get away with this? Is it too late? Do we want to? No, I have a hard time thinking about like bringing really elderly people to justice. There's something there's something that's hard for us to think like, oh my God, he's so old. Will he even know where he is? Do we really prosecute him? But that is what the law is currently doing in most Western countries.
I'm totally fine. The guy who's responsible for killing thousands of people, I'm totally fine that he's been hiding and he's outed now at 98 years old. I hope they take him away. And, I wouldn't mind him having the same fate that all of those people that he ended up killing.
We had this discussion over lunch.
I have no problem with it whatsoever.
There's a patheticness to it.
Yeah. And it would be even more pathetic to see him, come to justice. Absolutely, my opinion. I don't really care how old he is about it. If he spent his whole life atoning for it somehow, but that's not the case at all. Why is the ADL quiet on this, by the way? The Anti-Defamation League. You think that they would be out slamming the Trudeau government. But that's odd that the ADL is so quiet on this.
That's weird, right?
It's really, something smells really odd about the Anti-Defamation League.